Imagine living in a place where everything was allowed, where money could buy any type of pleasure, where parties lasted whole days and no one worried about tomorrow. Sodom and Gomorrah were paradises of lust, wealth and corruption, but behind the grand mansions and majestic temples there was a world of violence, betrayal, and endless perversion. Women were treated as objects, children were sacrificed in dark rituals, and the poor were left to die in the streets. Until one day, everything ended in flames. What really happened in these cities? What was it like to live in a place where morality simply didn't exist? Discover now the dark truth about Sodom and Gomorrah, wealth and luxury, prosperity that led to arrogance. Imagine walking through a city full of vibrant markets where traders trade gold, silver, and rare spices. The smell of roasting meat and freshly baked bread filled the streets. Men wearing luxurious robes transacted business, while servants carried jugs of oil and exotic wines. This was Sodom, a thriving commercial center where wealth flowed without limit. But this prosperity brought consequences that few realized in time. Sodom and Gomorrah were located in an extremely fertile region close to the Dead Sea. The fields around the cities were abundant, providing wheat, barley, and succulent fruits. This fertile soil allowed the inhabitants to accumulate wealth quickly. Trade prospered, with caravans coming from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other distant regions. The streets were busy, full of artisans, goldsmiths, and merchants displaying their most expensive wares. The richest lived in luxurious houses, built with polished stones and decorated with fine imported fabrics. In the city center, imposing palaces reflected the grandeur of its most powerful inhabitants. Parties were common, bringing together nobles and influential merchants who flaunted their fortunes at extravagant dinners. There was never a shortage of wine, and food was served in exaggerated quantities. However, there was another side to wealth. Inequality was evident. While the rich feasted, the poor were ignored by those who had more than they needed. Asking for help was useless, as the culture of Sodom did not value compassion, and kindness was seen as weakness. Commerce was also marked by greed. Adulterated weights were used to deceive buyers, merchants charged absurd prices, and the powerful exploited workers without mercy. If someone fell into debt, they could easily be sold into slavery to pay off their debts. Justice favored the richest, while the poor had nowhere to turn. The city on the outside was a spectacle of wealth, but inside it was a place where arrogance and exploitation reigned. For the rich, Sodom was a paradise. For the poor, it was hell on earth. But Sodom's wealth brought something even worse, a society that believed itself untouchable. The inhabitants thought they would never face consequences for their lifestyle. But the fate of these cities was already sealed, and their destruction would come in an overwhelming way. What comes next may be just what you need to know about the true face of Sodom and Gomorrah. But if you believe that greed and selfishness still corrupt our society, declare your faith in the comments. Now write, "My trust is in God, not in riches." Let us show that there is a better way than the pride of Sodom. The architecture and organization of the city shine on the outside, rot on the inside. If you arrived in Sodom for the first time, you would be impressed. From a distance, the city looked like an example of advanced civilization for the time. The walls were high, the towers rose above the hills, and the main streets were always full of life. Merchants shouted their offerings amid rushing crowds, while priests performed rituals in grand temples dedicated to pagan gods. But a closer look was enough to realize that behind this facade of wealth and progress, there was an environment of corruption and decadence. Sodom and Gomorrah were not small cities. They were influential urban centers, situated in a strategic location close to the Dead Sea. This position favored trade and communication with other people, making cities mandatory crossing points for merchants and travelers. The architecture was impressive for the time. There were palaces, luxurious mansions, wide squares, and majestic temples. The houses of the richest were made of polished stones, with imposing columns and internal courtyards decorated with statues and mosaics. The squares were the heart of the city. During the day, these places bustled with commercial activities. Merchants traded rare fabrics, jewelry, and spices. Some sold perfumes brought from Egypt, while others sold hand-embroidered rugs from distant lands. But at night, the scenery changed drastically. The same squares that were used for commerce during the day were transformed into places of wild festivals and pagan rituals. Musicians played flutes and drums, while crowds indulged in provocative dances and religious ceremonies involving sacrifices and immoral practices. Despite all this apparent splendor, the city was chaos for those who did not belong to the elite. Side streets and dark alleys were dangerous. There were no laws that really protected the weakest. Those who were robbed or attacked rarely found justice. If a crime did happen, the victim was often ignored, while the criminals continued their lives without any punishment. The judges and rulers were corrupt and only favored those who could offer them something in return. Poor neighborhoods were far from central areas. In these regions, the streets were cramped and dirty, full of makeshift shacks. Residents lived in precarious conditions, without access to basic resources, while the rich feasted. A loaf of bread was the most the poor could hope for. And the worst thing is that there was no compassion. The culture of Sodom and Gomorrah did not encourage charity or solidarity. On the contrary, those in need were seen as useless, and helping the weak was considered a waste of time. In the more noble areas, pagan temples dominated the scene. They were gigantic constructions designed to impress, dedicated to different deities, many of them linked to fertility and pleasure. The priests who administered these temples had great political and economic influence. Rituals included extravagant banquets and ceremonies that mixed religion with carnal pleasures. For many inhabitants, these practices were just part of the city's culture, but in reality, they contributed to an increasingly decadent society. Another curious element of Sodom's organization was the absence of a strong army. The city relied so much on its wealth and high walls that it neglected military security. This arrogance would be a fatal mistake later, when his destruction became inevitable. On the outside, Sodom shined like a jewel. Inside, it was a rotten society where only the strongest and greediest would survive. It was a city without laws, without mercy, and without a future. But what happened on the streets was just a reflection of what was rooted in the people's culture. And as violence became part of everyday life, Sodom sank deeper into its own ruin. The world may ignore justice, but God sees everything. If you believe that true justice comes from Him, write in the comments, "God is my judge." If you could travel back in time and walk the streets of Sodom at nightfall, you would see something impressive. The sound of music would echo through the squares, coming from houses lit by torches and halls where the party never ended. Men and women danced shamelessly, drunk on wine and unbridled desire. In Sodom, pleasure was the only law, and any limits were disregarded. The city had become a stronghold of absolute hedonism, where parties began at sunset and often lasted for days on end. Eating and drinking to exhaustion were seen as status symbols, and the more extravagant the celebration, the greater the respect and prestige earned by the host. In imposing palaces, nobles organized banquets filled with exotic meats, rare fruits and spices that came from distant lands. The wine flowed without interruption, and the guests indulged in the most diverse excesses. In the streets, troubadours and dancers entertained the population, while rich men walked accompanied by servants and slaves, often forced to satisfy the desires of their masters. Infidelity was not only common, but expected, and the concept of marriage and commitment was mocked. Anyone who tried to live by any moral code was the butt of jokes and mockery. Pagan temples played a central role in this way of life, promoting rituals of unlimited pleasure. Priests and priestesses held celebrations dedicated to fertility gods, and many of these rituals involved orgies and degrading practices. People believed that by indulging in these acts, they would be attracting blessings to their crops and businesses. But in reality, they were just sinking deeper into a spiral of depravity. The city prided itself on having no moral rules. His motto was simple: if it gives you pleasure, do it. However, this incessant search for personal satisfaction came at a high cost. Corruption was not only a cultural characteristic, but it was also present in the hearts of its inhabitants. Relationships were superficial, driven by momentary interests, and true love had disappeared, replaced by the insatiable need for new experiences. The consequences of this way of life were evident. Violence became increasingly common, especially when one person's pleasures conflicted with another's desires. Jealousy, betrayal, and disputes resulted in murders in the dark streets of the city. The weak were exploited, and pity or compassion seemed to have been completely eradicated from the hearts of the inhabitants. Foreigners who arrived in Sodom were initially impressed by the city's vibrant life, but they soon realized the truth. You were only welcome there if you were willing to submit to the rules of debauchery. Any attempt at resistance was ridiculed and, in many cases, persecuted. Sodom had become a place where pleasure ruled, but ironically, the city was on the brink of ruin. The people failed to realize that their obsession with excess was slowly destroying their own society, and what came next was even darker. The violence on the streets of Sodom was no mere accident. It reflected the corrupted soul of its inhabitants. Violence and lack of laws turned the streets into a hunting ground. In the center of the city, the nobles still celebrated in their palaces, but in the dark alleys, the reality was different. Anyone who dared to walk alone could easily be attacked. Robberies, beatings, and even murders were frequent. And the most terrifying thing of all was that no one cared. If a person was found dead in the morning, their body would simply be ignored or discarded as if it were trash. The city was governed by the law of the strongest. There were no fair rules or a reliable legal system. The rulers and judges were among the most corrupt, favoring those who could bribe them. If a rich man committed a crime, all it took was a generous amount of money to forget everything. If a poor person tried to seek justice, they were ridiculed and often punished for bothering the powerful. Foreigners arriving in the city faced an even worse fate. In many ancient cultures, hospitality was considered a sacred value, but in Sodom, the opposite was true. Travelers were seen as easy prey, with some being attacked and beaten, while others were publicly humiliated. It was not uncommon for groups of drunken men to hunt outsiders, subjecting them to abuse and torture just for fun. And worst of all, there was no one to protect them. Violence was not only tolerated, but encouraged. Among younger people, showing cruelty against the weakest was seen almost as a rite of passage. The rich competed with each other to see who could throw the wildest parties, often involving slaves and prisoners who were forced to participate in brutal games. Empathy was gone. The suffering of others became entertainment. The poorest neighborhoods were the most affected, while the nobles protected themselves with private guards. Those who lived on the streets or in shacks had nowhere to turn. The robberies took place in broad daylight, and no one bothered to stop them. Women and children were the most vulnerable. If kidnapped or taken as slaves, hardly anyone would stand up to defend them. The justice system, if it could be called that, was completely corrupt. If a powerful businessman wanted to get rid of a competitor, all he had to do was falsely accuse him of a crime, and the accused would be arrested or killed without any chance of defense. Trials were just formalities, and the truth was worthless. The arrogance of Sodom's rulers was such that they believed that nothing could destroy the city. His reasoning was simple. We were the richest, the strongest, and the most feared. No one would dare challenge us. This false sense of invincibility caused the city to sink further into chaos. What happened on the streets was just a reflection of what existed in the hearts of the inhabitants. They had lost any sense of morality, and respect for life no longer existed. Each person saw the other as an object, an obstacle, or an opportunity for their own benefit. But what no one imagined was that the real danger would not come from outside. Sodom would not be destroyed by enemy armies or political disputes. Judgment was approaching from an unexpected place. And now you will discover how far the city had come in its decline and why its destruction was inevitable. Sodom ignored the warnings, but we may be different. If you believe that loving your neighbor can transform the world, comment now. Jesus taught me. Let's make this message reach more people. The role of women and children in society was equally grim. If a woman or a child were born in Sodom, their destiny was practically sealed. There was no place for protection, nor to guarantee the dignity of the weakest. On the contrary, it was a society where the most vulnerable were treated as disposable chattel. Women had no value beyond their usefulness to men. From a young age, they learned that their survival depended on the status of their family or the marriage they managed to arrange. Love was not the basis of marriages. They were mere political or economic agreements. A man could marry several times, accumulating wives like someone who accumulated wealth. But if a woman was considered unwanted, she could be abandoned without any consequences for her husband. Widows were among the most vulnerable. If they did not have an influential family or wealth of their own, they were simply forgotten by society. Many of them ended up on the streets, surviving on charity that almost didn't exist in Sodom. Helping the weak was seen as a sign of weakness. Children also did not escape this cruel reality. There was no concern for their education or well-being. The children of the rich had some education, but were raised to follow the same greedy and immoral ways as their parents. The children of the poor were forced to work or live begging on the streets. Many children were sold as slaves, traded as if they were simple commodities. The most disturbing aspect of this society was its relationship with pagan rituals. Many ancient cultures practiced human sacrifice to appease their gods, and in Sodom, such rituals were part of everyday life. This happened in a terrifying way. Children were delivered to stone altars, burned alive in macabre rituals with the false hope of ensuring good harvests or protection from enemies. A child's cry was ignored, as it was believed that his death would bring benefits to the city. Morality had already been completely erased, and human life had no value in a society where only pleasure and wealth mattered. The most vulnerable were those who suffered the most, and all of this brings us to another aspect of this city, one of the most revolting. While the poor were already suffering in silence, those in need were treated as if they didn't even exist. The poor were despised, and the city had no love for its neighbors. Walking through the streets of Sodom was witnessing an absurd contrast. While the rich displayed jewels and feasted in their mansions, the poor starved to death just a few meters away. The Bible mentions that one of Sodom's greatest sins was its indifference to those in need. In Ezekiel 16:49 it is written, "Behold, this was the iniquity of Sodom, your sister, pride, abundance of bread and prosperous tranquility had she and her daughters, but she never helped the poor and the needy." Selfishness ruled the city. People were concerned only with their own pleasures, without looking at others. Anyone who was poor was not only ignored, they were often ridiculed. If anyone asked for alms, they were kicked out of the square. If he tried to seek justice, he was humiliated and threatened. The merchants had no mercy. If a poor person could not pay, they received nothing. There was no compassion, help, or any kind of solidarity. In Sodom's mindset, if someone was poor, it was because they were not strong enough to survive. And this belief further fueled the culture of exploitation. In many ancient cities, foreigners were welcomed with hospitality, but in Sodom, it was the opposite. If a traveler arrived in the city without wealth, he ran the serious risk of being attacked, humiliated, or even killed. The simple fact of being an outsider was reason to be exploited or ridiculed. This coldness was not limited to strangers. Even within families, love was disappearing. Brothers betrayed brothers, parents despised children, and children abandoned elderly parents. The concept of community had been replaced by the idea of individual survival at any cost. Sodom and Gomorrah were completely rotten from the inside, not only by perversion and violence, but by the total absence of compassion. But every city that builds its foundation on selfishness and pride will one day crumble, and for Sodom, that day was closer than its inhabitants imagined. Arrogance destroyed Sodom, but humility brings us closer to God. If you believe this, write in the comments, "God restores my life." The last day of Sodom, when sin brought destruction, began like any other. The sun shone over the city's palaces and markets. In the streets, merchants shouted their offerings. Rich houses organized new banquets, and pagan temples were ready for another day of profane rituals. The city pulsed, immersed in luxury, arrogance, and pleasure. For the inhabitants of Sodom, that was just another day of excess, but no one imagined it would be the last. The night before, something unusual happened. Two mysterious outsiders arrived in town. The news spread quickly, and a group of violent men decided that these visitors would not go unharmed. What no one knew was that these men were not simple travelers. They were angels sent for a specific purpose: to destroy the city. The house where the angels were staying was surrounded, and the inhabitants demanded that they be handed over to them, showing once again the wickedness that dominated Sodom. But something unexpected happened. A blinding light blinded the attackers, leaving them stunned and powerless. This was the sign that Sodom's time was over. At dawn, the angel spoke to Lot, one of the few righteous men left there. "Leave here, take your family, and don't look back. This place will be destroyed." The warning was clear and definitive, but even so, there was hesitation. After all, how can you abandon everything suddenly? How could they accept that the city where they lived for so many years would be reduced to ashes? As the sun rose above the horizon, Lot and his family hurriedly fled through the city gates. The rest of the population continued living as if nothing was happening. And then the moment came when the story of Sodom and Gomorrah would change forever. The sky, which until then had been blue and bright, began to darken. Heavy clouds appeared out of nowhere, bringing a strange and suffocating feeling. The wind changed, and a heavy silence took over the city. People began to wonder what was happening, and without warning, the first bolt of fire fell from the sky. Seconds later, flames began to pour down like a hellish storm. Brimstone and fire consumed everything they touched. Rich houses collapsed, temples burst into flames, and markets were destroyed in moments. Men and women ran desperately, trying to find shelter, but there was nowhere to run. The heat was unbearable. The air was filled with smoke and cries of despair. The mansions that were once symbols of luxury and ostentation were now just piles of ashes. The streets, which were once filled with parties and sins, were now covered in charred bodies. Those who tried to escape were quickly consumed by the fire. It didn't matter if they were rich or poor, powerful or slaves. That day, everyone was facing the same fate. The city that had for so long defied any sense of morality now became a wasteland of destruction. But amid the chaos, a small group ran across the plain, moving away from the hell that consumed Sodom. Lot and his family were alive. They had escaped, but the warning had been clear. Don't look back. It was then that his wife, overcome by attachment to the city, made a fatal mistake. She stopped, turned to look, and in that instant her body stiffened. Within seconds, she turned into a pillar of salt. His heart still belonged to Sodom, and therefore he had the same end as the city. When it was all over, what was once a thriving metropolis was now just a desert of smoldering ash. Nothing remained, no trace of its past glory, only charred ruins and the smell of sulfur in the air. The city that, for so long believed to be untouchable, had been destroyed in a single day. Pride, wickedness, and lack of compassion brought Sodom and Gomorrah to their end, and this story serves as a powerful reminder. No civilization, no matter how rich and powerful, survives when it chooses to defy all principles of justice and kindness. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the paths we are choosing, share it with your friends and family. Let's spread this message of reflection and transformation. Don't forget to like and comment on what you learned from this lesson. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss out on more content that could change your perspective on life. Remember, change starts with each of us. See you in the next video.